James Carter was not just any passenger boarding that flight from New York to Los Angeles. He was one of those rare people you couldn't help but notice, even if you didn't know who he was. Tall, confident, and impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit that looked like it was tailored just for him, which, of course, it was. He carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had built his own success from the ground up. At only 42 years old, he was already the CEO of a billion-dollar tech company, a leader in innovation and a respected voice in the business world. His name often appeared in magazines like Forbes and Bloomberg, but James had never been one to flaunt his wealth or power. To him, success wasn't about showing off. It was about standards, and one of those standards was respect. That morning, winter air in New York was crisp as James stepped out of the black luxury sedan that had brought him to JFK Airport. His assistant, Olivia, had already checked him in and secured his preferred seat in first class, a window seat, toward the front where he could work in peace or simply watch the clouds drift by. He wasn't traveling for pleasure. He was scheduled to deliver the opening speech at one of the biggest technology summits in Los Angeles, an event attended by CEOs, investors, and leaders from around the world. His speech had the potential to open new doors for partnerships and opportunities, but James wasn't feeling nervous. He had prepared for weeks, and all he needed now was a smooth flight to arrive rested and ready. James wasn't the kind of person to treat first-class travel as a luxury. To him, it was a necessity. Long flights were an opportunity to work, recharge, and prepare his mind. First class offered the comfort, space, and service that allowed him to do that without distraction. He appreciated the details: the larger seat, the quieter cabin, and the carefully prepared meals. These small comforts mattered, especially when your days were packed with meetings, decisions, and travel schedules that often left little time to breathe. This wasn't about being spoiled. It was about efficiency and maintaining a high standard. For himself, as he walked through the VIP boarding lane, James greeted the airline staff with a polite nod and a calm smile. He wasn't one to demand attention, but people naturally gave it to him. There was something about the way he carried himself, a mix of humility and quiet confidence that drew respect. He took his seat, placed his laptop bag neatly in the overhead bin, and settled in. The cabin smelled faintly of fresh coffee and new leather, and the soft hum of the air conditioning filled the quiet space. A flight attendant offered him a glass of water, which he accepted with a polite thank you. James glanced at his watch. He liked to keep track of time, not just for his schedule, but because punctuality was a habit deeply ingrained in him. In business, being on time wasn't optional. It was a sign of respect for others. The same applied to everything in his life, from meetings to meals to flights. As the other first-class passengers arrived, James kept to himself, reviewing his speech notes on a sleek tablet. He wasn't reading word for word. He preferred to speak naturally, rather than memorize lines, but he liked to remind himself of key points and ideas. This speech wasn't just about impressing the crowd. It was about inspiring them. Wanted them to see that innovation wasn't just about technology, but also about leadership, ethics, and the courage to do things differently. The flight was scheduled to last just over 6 hours, which meant plenty of time for him to get some work done and enjoy the premium meal service he had requested in advance. His assistant had made sure his dietary preferences were noted, not because he was picky, but because he was disciplined about what he ate. Years of traveling had taught him that eating the right food on a flight could mean the difference between feeling sharp and energetic upon arrival, or sluggish and tired as boarding continued. A few passengers recognized him and whispered to each other, but no one approached him for photos or autographs. That was something James appreciated about first-class travel: privacy. Here, people valued their space. Here, he could simply be another passenger, not James Carter, the tech billionaire. He took a sip of his water, opened a file on his tablet and began typing a quick email to his Los Angeles team, confirming his arrival time and requesting a car to take him directly from the airport to the hotel. Outside the large oval window beside him, James could see ground crew members moving quickly in their reflective vests, loading luggage and preparing the aircraft for departure. It was a well-orchestrated routine, and James couldn't help but appreciate the professionalism of it all. He liked order, precision, and attention to detail qualities he demanded in his own company. If something went wrong, he believed in addressing it directly and immediately. He didn't accept excuses when there was a better way to do things. At that moment, James had no idea that this flight, which he had expected to be uneventful, was about to become one of the most talked about airline incidents of the year. He didn't know that within hours his name would be trending on social media, or that millions of people around the world would be debating whether he had gone too far or simply stood up for himself. Right now, all he knew was that he had a speech to give, a team waiting for him, and a first-class seat that promised a smooth journey ahead. He adjusted his seatbelt as the captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers and announcing an on-time departure. James leaned back slightly, took a slow breath, and prepared to enjoy the next 6 hours in peace. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. This flight would not only test his patience, it would challenge his principles in a way he hadn't anticipated. And for James Carter, principles were something worth standing up for, no matter the cost. James adjusted the cuffs of his shirt as the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. The low rumble of the engines was almost comforting, a reminder that the long day ahead was finally beginning its next phase. He leaned slightly toward the window, watching the airport lights blur as the aircraft turned. There was something about flying at night that always fascinated him, the quiet hum, a sense of detachment from the world below, the knowledge that for the next several hours, the cabin would be his universe. In first class, everything was designed to make you forget the chaos of travel. The seats were wide and soft, angled to give maximum comfort without disturbing the passenger beside you. There was no hurried chatter or loud arguments about overhead space. Instead, there was calm, the kind of calm that came with knowing you had paid for an experience where every detail mattered. And for James, this wasn't just about money. It was about what he valued most: efficiency, respect, and professionalism. He reached for the neatly folded menu placed on the tray in front of him. The paper was thick and smooth, the font elegant. There were 3 meal options listed for dinner service, each accompanied by a short, almost poetic description. James's choice, however, had been confirmed days before. His assistant, Olivia, had spoken to the airline's premium services department to ensure his preferred meal would be on board: a light grilled salmon with roasted vegetables, prepared without heavy sauces, paired with sparkling water. It was exactly what his diet required to keep him alert and energized for the evening's work ahead. This wasn't about luxury, it was about control. James had learned a long time ago that small disruptions could ripple into larger problems. The wrong meal could lead to discomfort, which could affect his focus, which could weaken his performance. And for someone in his position, performance was everything. The first-class dining experience in his mind was part of a larger system, a contract between passenger and airline. You paid for a certain level of service, and in return, the airline delivered without cutting corners. A flight attendant passed by, her smile practiced but warm. She stopped briefly at his seat. "Mr. Carter, we'll be serving your dinner shortly after takeoff. Is there anything you'd like before then?" James returned her smile politely. "Just water for now, thank you." She nodded, placing a glass on the small polished table beside him before gliding toward the galley. James took a sip and set the glass down, his mind briefly drifting to the speech he would give in Los Angeles. It was a big moment, not just for him, but for his company. Industry leaders, investors, and media would all be there. The right words could inspire millions. The wrong ones could fade into the noise. Preparation was important, but so was his state of mind. This flight needed to be quiet, comfortable, and, above all, predictable. Around him, other first-class passengers were settling in. Some were scrolling through tablets, others chatting softly with companions. The soft clink of champagne glasses could be heard as a couple celebrated a wedding anniversary. James glanced at them briefly, appreciating the joy in their smiles. He had nothing against indulgence. He simply valued function over excess. For him, first class wasn't about being pampered for the sake of it. It was about creating an environment where he could operate at his best. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft climbed. The view outside shifting from city lights to a blanket of darkness punctured by distant stars. James opened his tablet again, scanning a few last notes. He felt calm, assured that the next few hours would follow the routine he had come to expect. A quiet dinner, a couple of hours of work, and then some rest before landing. In his years of flying, James had learned that first-class travel was not just a service, but a promise that the details had been taken care of so he could focus on what mattered. The airline knew his preferences. They had confirmed his requests, and he trusted they would deliver. After all, that was why people like him chose to pay for the privilege, not for extravagance, but for reliability. As the seatbelt signs switched off and the cabin crew began preparing for service, James glanced once more at the menu and then closed it, confident in what was coming. He imagined the warm plate arriving at his table, the aroma of fresh herbs rising with the steam. He pictured himself enjoying the meal slowly, savoring the flavors while reading over his final notes. In his mind, everything was in place. What James didn't know was that the very thing he had taken for granted, the promise of service that matched his expectations, was about to be broken. And when it was, it wouldn't just be a small inconvenience. It would ignite a chain of events that no one on that plane, not even James himself, could have predicted. The hum of the engines was steady, almost hypnotic, as the plane cruised high above the clouds. James sat comfortably in his seat, the soft leather cradling him as he made a few quick edits to his presentation slides. Every so often, he would glance at the flight map on the screen in front of him, the little plane inching across the country toward Los Angeles. It had been about 40 minutes since takeoff when the aroma of warm bread and herbs began drifting from the galley. The faint clink of silverware being arranged told him the dinner service was about to begin. James closed his tablet, set it neatly on the side table, and sat back. The calm, efficient rhythm of first-class service was something he had come to appreciate. It was predictable, professional, and smooth. Or at least, it usually was. The flight attendant from earlier approached with a polite smile, a small notepad in hand. "Mr. Carter, about your meal," she began, her tone hesitant. James looked up, expecting to hear a simple update, perhaps a delay of a few minutes. "Yes," he said, his voice calm. The attendant shifted slightly, her smile faltering. "I'm afraid we don't have your requested salmon tonight." James blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "You mean it hasn't been prepared yet?" She shook her head, her voice quieter now. "No, sir. It's not on board." The words landed heavier than they should have. It wasn't about the food itself. James could have eaten something else. It was about the principle. His assistant had confirmed this meal with the airline days ago, and his dietary requirements weren't a luxury. They were essential for his health and focus. The airline had promised, and in James's world, a promise wasn't something you broke casually. "What options do I have instead?" he asked evenly, giving her the chance to resolve the situation. She glanced at her notepad, then back at him. "Unfortunately, nothing that meets your listed preferences, sir. We have beef, chicken, and a vegetarian pasta, but they don't match the dietary notes we received." James took a slow breath. So, nothing at all. The attendant hesitated, then offered a half shrug. I'm sorry. It happens sometimes. Maybe you can have something after landing. That last sentence hit differently. It wasn't just unhelpful, it felt dismissive. The tone, the choice of words, even the way she lightly shifted her weight as if ready to move on, it all suggested she didn't see this as a serious matter. James wasn't a man who raised his voice or made a scene, but he could feel the weight of silence pressing around him. Nearby, another attendant was serving a passenger a steaming plate of roast beef. The rich aroma drifted over, but James didn't look at it. Instead, his eyes followed the attendant in front of him. Polite smile had returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. Understood, he said finally, his voice level. Thank you for letting me know. She nodded quickly and moved on, perhaps relieved the exchange hadn't turned confrontational. But as she walked away, James overheard faint laughter from the galley. Two voices, one of them hers, speaking. In a low tone that wasn't low enough. He caught fragments of a sentence, something about entitled passengers, and then the unmistakable sound of muffled amusement. For a moment, James sat still, his hands resting calmly on the armrests. Outwardly, he looked as composed as ever. Inside, however, a decision was forming. He wasn't angry in the impulsive, emotional way most people might be. His was a quiet, measured kind of reaction, the kind that didn't flare up and fade, but instead settled deep and stayed there until action was taken. James knew himself well. When someone broke their word, he could forgive it if they made it right. But when the broken promise was followed by disrespect, that was a line. That was when patience turned into resolve. He glanced out the window at the vast darkness below. The scattered lights of small towns far beneath the clouds. The flight would last several more hours, and he had no intention of escalating the matter mid-air. But he also had no intention of letting it go. From that moment on, James Carter was no longer just a passenger on a routine trip. He was a man making mental notes, preparing for a conversation that would happen on the ground, one that would be remembered by everyone involved. What no one else on that plane knew yet was that this quiet refusal of a meal was about to trigger a decision that would change the fate of the entire crew before the day was over. The dinner service continued as if nothing unusual had happened. The soft clink of cutlery, the quiet murmur of conversations, and the occasional chime of the call button filled the first-class cabin. But for James Carter, the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavier now, each passing minute making the earlier exchange echo louder in his mind. He was not the type to stew in anger, but he noticed details, small things that many people might miss, but that told him a lot about a person's attitude. The flight attendant who had spoken to him earlier now avoided making eye contact when she passed by. When she served other passengers, her tone was warmer, her smile broader. With him, it was mechanical, almost cold. James took a slow sip of his water, glancing discreetly toward the galley at the front of the cabin. From where he sat, he could just make out the silhouettes of two attendants leaning slightly toward each other. They were speaking quietly, but in the hushed space of first-class whispers had a way of carrying farther than people realized. You'd think he was royalty or something, one voice said, followed by the soft sound of laughter. James's jaw tightened slightly, though his expression didn't change. He wasn't sure if the remark was meant for him, but combined with the earlier entitled passenger comment he had overheard, there was little doubt in his mind. He shifted in his seat, his eyes scanning the cabin. Other passengers seemed oblivious to the subtle undercurrent, enjoying their meals or settling in for movies. James was good at keeping his emotions in check. Years in high-pressure negotiations had trained him to respond strategically. Impulsively, but that didn't mean disrespect slid off his back. On the contrary, It stayed with him, sharp and clear. It wasn't about a missed meal anymore. It was about what the situation revealed: a lack of professionalism, a failure to deliver on a promise, and a dismissive attitude toward a paying customer, one who had been assured in writing that his needs would be met. And two, James, respect, was not determined by who a person was. It was simply the minimum standard in any service interaction. Another attendant, not the one from before, stopped by to offer him a bread roll. "No, thank you," James said politely. She nodded and moved on, but he noticed how quickly she turned her back, as if eager to avoid any conversation. James's mind began to shift gears. In his company, if an employee treated a client with such disregard, there would be consequences. Not out of cruelty, but because every interaction represented the brand. A single negative experience could damage trust, and trust was the foundation of every successful business. He believed airlines, especially in first class, should operate the same way. As the flight wore on, James resumed working on his tablet, though his focus was sharper than before. Between reviewing slides and responding to emails, he was quietly documenting the events of the evening. Names, times, exact words. He recorded them all. He even made note of the fact that the promised meal had been confirmed multiple times prior to departure. Occasionally, his eyes would lift toward the galley where laughter and casual chatter continued. He didn't react outwardly, but each time it happened, it only reinforced his decision. This wasn't just a matter for customer service to handle with a coupon or a generic apology. This was a breach of standards that demanded a more decisive response. Outside the window, the night sky stretched endlessly, the stars shimmering like distant cities. James looked at them for a moment, the quiet beauty of the scene contrasting sharply with the irritation simmering beneath the surface. In a way, the view reminded him of business, serene on the outside, but full of unseen currents beneath. The captain's voice broke the quiet, announcing their position and expected arrival time. Passengers shifted in their seats, some preparing to sleep, others ordering coffee or dessert. For James, the announcement was a reminder that the real confrontation would happen after landing. Up here, 35,000 feet above the ground, there was little point in escalating things. Down there, however, in the structured environment of the airport, he would make sure his voice was heard. By the time the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight portion of the flight, James had already decided. This was not going to be resolved with a polite complaint email. When he stepped off this plane, the airline's management would know exactly what happened and why it was unacceptable. And once James Carter decided to take action, he never did it halfway. Little did the crew know, the quiet man in seat 2A was not just a businessman traveling for work. He was a man with influence, resources, and a zero-tolerance policy for disrespect. And in just a few hours, their world was about to turn upside down. James leaned back in his seat, the dim glow of the overhead reading light casting a warm circle around him. From the outside, he looked perfectly calm, almost relaxed, but beneath that composed exterior, his mind was moving with precision, like a machine quietly mapping out its next steps. Years of experience in the corporate world had taught him one of the most valuable lessons a leader could learn. You don't respond in anger. You respond with strategy. He glanced at the glass of water beside him, the condensation slowly dripping down its surface. He wasn't thirsty, but he kept it there, untouched, almost as a silent anchor, a reminder to stay cool, steady, and deliberate. The rest of the first-class cabin had fallen into a gentle rhythm. Some passengers were dozing with eye masks in place, while others scrolled through movies or listened to music. The cabin lights were low now, giving the space a soft, almost serene atmosphere. But James wasn't settling into rest. He was working, not on his speech for the summit anymore, but on something far more immediate. Every detail from the last 2 hours was being cataloged in his mind. The moment the attendant informed him of the missing meal, the tone she used, the dismissive comment about entitled passengers, the uneven warmth shown to other travelers, and even the overheard laughter in the galley. It was all part of a bigger picture, one that he would present to the right people when the time came. He opened a fresh document on his tablet and began typing brief, factual notes. He didn't exaggerate, didn't add emotion, he simply wrote what happened, step by step, in chronological order. He even noted the times, glancing at the small clock in the corner of his seat's display screen. To James, details were not just important, they were everything. When you wanted to hold someone accountable, you didn't argue with feelings. You argued with facts. Occasionally, he would look up from his screen to observe the crew. The lead attendant walked through the aisle now and then, checking on passengers. She never stopped at his row, never asked if he needed anything. It was subtle neglect, the kind you might miss if you weren't paying attention. James noticed, in his own company, customer service wasn't just a department, it was the foundation of the business. Every employee was trained to treat each client as if they were the most important person in the world. He had personally fired executives who failed to respect that principle. To him, this wasn't about ego. It was about standards. And if you couldn't meet them, you had no place representing the brand. That philosophy was now shaping how he viewed this situation. This crew, in his eyes, wasn't just failing him. They were failing the airline's brand, breaking the unspoken contract that first-class passengers relied on. And in James's mind, breaking that contract had consequences. The hours ticked by slowly. But James didn't rush his thinking. He was patient. Patience was one of his sharpest tools. He understood that the way you approached a problem often determined the outcome. If he lashed out mid-flight, emotions would cloud the facts. But if he waited, if he acted at the right time, in the right place, the impact would be far greater. From time to time, he glanced out the window. The world outside was silent and endless, the wing of the plane cutting through the night sky like a silver blade. Somewhere far below, tiny towns and highways were scattered like faint constellations. He wondered briefly if anyone down there was awake, looking up, imagining the lives of the people flying overhead. Back in the cabin, James's eyes returned to his notes. He added one final observation. Tone and attitude indicate lack of training or disregard for professionalism. He underlined it once. That, he decided, would be his central point when speaking to the airline's senior management. By the time the captain's voice came over the speakers to announce their descent into Los Angeles, James's mind was clear. He knew exactly what he was going to say, exactly who he was going to say it to, and exactly what outcome he expected. There would be no shouting, no public outburst, just a direct, formal conversation with people in positions of authority. And when that conversation happened, it wouldn't just be about one meal or one flight. It would be about something bigger, a lesson in accountability. James Carter was ready. The crew, however, had no idea what was about to hit them. The cabin lights brightened slowly as the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into Los Angeles. Passengers stirred awake, stretching, fastening seatbelts. The flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, collecting glasses and trays, smiling their polite, almost their smiles. James Carter didn't move much. He had been awake for most of the flight, his mind sharp and his plan ready. As the plane dipped through the clouds, he could see the sprawling lights of Los Angeles shimmering below like a carpet of gold. Somewhere down there, a team of airline managers would be starting their morning, unaware that in less than an hour, they would be facing a conversation that could change the course of their day, and possibly their careers. The landing itself was smooth. Tires met runway with a muted thump, followed by the familiar roar of reverse thrust. Passengers exhaled, some applauding softly. James stayed silent, watching the runway lights flash past. He didn't clap for the end of a flight. He measured it by what happened from boarding to disembarkation, and this one had failed that test. As the plane taxied toward the gate, he reached for his leather briefcase, sliding his tablet inside. The notes he had made during the flight were now organized, bullet-pointed, and ready. He wasn't going to hand them over like a complaint letter. He was going to speak them, clearly and directly, to the highest authority he could find. The seatbelt sign turned off. The cabin filled with the soft shuffle of people retrieving bags and jackets. James stayed seated, letting the rush of eager passengers move ahead. He wasn't in a hurry to get to baggage claim. His business was here, at the gate. The lead attendant approached, avoiding his eyes as she thanked other passengers. When she finally reached him, she managed a brief, professional smile. "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Carter. We hope to see you again." James returned the smile, but his eyes were steady. "I'll be speaking with your management before I decide on that," he said quietly. Her smile froze, just for a second, before she nodded and stepped aside. When the last passenger had stepped off, James gathered his things and walked toward the jet bridge. The air outside the aircraft was cooler, tinged with that distinct scent of airport terminals, a mix of metal, coffee, and faint jet fuel. Waiting just past the boarding door were two airline ground staff in neatly pressed uniforms, clipboards in hand. "Mr. Carter?" one of them asked. "Yes. I'm Sarah, Operations Supervisor. We understand you wanted to speak with management." "That's correct," James said. His tone was even, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. Not just management, senior management. Sarah exchanged a quick glance with the other staff member. "We can take you to the VIP lounge and arrange that immediately." James followed without another word. They led him through the quiet, early morning terminal past clusters of passengers waiting for their flights. The click of his polished shoes on the tile floor was steady, unhurried. Every step was a reminder to himself and to those watching that he was in complete control of the moment. Inside the lounge, he was offered a seat at a private table. A pot of coffee appeared within minutes, along with a promise that the station manager was on his way. James didn't touch the coffee. He preferred to keep his mind sharp, and caffeine wasn't necessary right now. His focus was its own fuel. When the station manager arrived, James stood to shake his hand. "Mr. Carter," the man began warmly. "I understand there was an issue on your flight." James met his eyes. "It was more than an issue, and I want to explain it to you in detail, so there's no misunderstanding about why I'm here." And then, with the calm precision of a man delivering a quarterly report, James began to recount the events of the flight, every word, every action, every missed opportunity for professionalism. He spoke without raising his voice, but each sentence carried weight. He described how his meal request had been confirmed in advance, how it was unavailable without explanation, how dismissive remarks were overheard, and how service quality had been inconsistent between passengers. The manager listened, his expression gradually tightening. James didn't embellish or dramatize. He simply told the truth, supported by times, quotes, and observations. It was impossible to brush off by the time he finished. The room was silent for a long moment. James sat back, his message delivered. "This isn't about a plate of food," he said, finally. "It's about your standards and whether or not you have any." The station manager nodded slowly. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, this will be addressed immediately." James's eyes stayed on him, steady and unblinking. "I'm counting on it." He didn't ask for vouchers. He didn't demand compensation. He asked for action. And deep down, the manager knew that a man like James wouldn't be satisfied with anything less than decisive measures. What happened next would ripple far beyond this lounge. The quiet businessman from 2A had set something in motion, and before the day was over, the crew from that flight would discover just how far his influence reached. The meeting in the VIP lounge ended without raised voices, without slammed doors, but with a heavy, almost electric silence. The station manager stood up, shaking James Carter's hand one last time. His face composed, but his eyes carrying an urgency that hadn't been there before. James could tell the man was already calculating his next moves. James watched him leave, calm as ever, before finally taking a sip of the now cold coffee in front of him. It wasn't victory he felt, not yet. In business, results weren't about what was promised in the room, but what happened afterward. And James had been around long enough to know that if you wanted things done, you had to plant your message deep enough that it couldn't be ignored. The lounge attendant quietly approached to let him know his driver was waiting outside. James nodded and rose from his seat. But before he could leave, the operations supervisor from earlier, Sarah, appeared again. She looked slightly tense, as if holding back information. "Mr. Carter," she began, "I thought you should know. The station manager has already contacted our central operations team. They've called in replacements for the crew." James's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Replacements?" She nodded. "Effective immediately. The crew from your flight has been stood down from service pending review." In the airline world, pending review was more than just a pause. It was often the first step toward termination, especially when high-profile complaints came from influential passengers. James said nothing at first, simply absorbing the information. He wasn't surprised. This wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure the same mistake didn't happen to the next passenger, or the one after that, as he walked out of the lounge and into the crisp morning air outside the terminal. His driver opened the back door of a sleek black sedan. James slid into the seat, the leather cool against his palms. He glanced briefly at his phone. No messages from the airline yet, and then looked out the tinted window as the car pulled away. Back inside the terminal, the decision was already creating ripples. In a small crew briefing room tucked away, near the service corridors, the flight attendants from James's journey were gathered. Their expressions ranged from confusion to disbelief. The lead attendant, the same one who had told James's meal wasn't available, sat with her arms crossed, defensive. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. A uniformed crew manager entered, holding a printed document. "I've just been informed that due to a customer service incident reported this morning, your rostered flights are canceled until further notice. You are not to operate any services until a formal hearing is completed." A murmur swept the room. One of the younger attendants spoke up. "Is this because of the guy in 2A? The manager's face was unreadable. "Details are confidential. But I will say this, when a passenger like him files a report, corporate listens, and they act fast." James, miles away by now, wasn't thinking about the crew's reaction. He wasn't thinking about their whispers or their sudden scramble to defend themselves. He was already moving forward, reviewing his speech for the summit, focused on the work ahead. In his mind, the matter was closed. He had said what needed to be said, and the people responsible for enforcing standards had acted. The irony was that James hadn't demanded anyone be fired. He had simply presented the facts and made it clear that, in his view, the crew had failed. The basic requirements of professionalism, applied in industries where reputation was everything. Sometimes the truth alone was enough to decide someone's fate. By the time the sedan reached his hotel, James was already in a different headspace. The city outside was waking up, streets filling, sunlight bouncing off glass towers, the hum of life returning. He stepped out of the car, briefcase in hand, and walked toward the lobby without a backward glance. Somewhere above the runway he had landed on hours earlier, a new crew was preparing an outbound flight, while the one he had just left behind was packing up their uniforms, uncertain of their future. Decisions like this didn't always happen fast, but when they did, it was because someone with influence had made sure the message couldn't be ignored. And James Carter was exactly that kind of person. By the time James Carter stepped onto the stage at the Los Angeles Business Summit later that afternoon, the airline incident from that morning was already starting to take on a life of its own. He hadn't spoken publicly about it, hadn't posted a single word online. But stories like this had a way of escaping into the world. Somewhere between the gate at LAX and the quiet corridors of the VIP lounge, whispers had started. A few passengers from first class had told their friends what they'd seen, a high-profile CEO being denied his confirmed meal. The overheard remarks and the tense but controlled conversation after landing. In the age of smartphones and instant communication, whispers traveled faster than planes. By early evening, blogs and small news outlets had picked up the story. The headlines were designed to stop thumbs mid-scroll. Black CEO refused first class. Meal entire flight crew fired after landing high-profile passengers complaint grounds whole airline crew. Social media, as always, was quick to divide itself into camps. Some applauded James for standing up for himself, framing it as a moment of accountability in an industry where customers often felt powerless. Finally, someone with influence is showing airlines they can't treat people like that, one user tweeted, racking up thousands of likes. Others questioned whether the crew deserved to lose their jobs over what they saw as a minor service error. Over a meal? Really? Read another post. James himself said nothing, choosing not to feed the noise. He knew better than to get into public arguments. He believed the facts were enough. Still, his silence only fueled speculation. Reporters emailed his company's media office. Journalists waited outside the summit, and influencers dissected the incident in video after video. By the next morning, national outlets had picked it up. Television hosts debated it over coffee mugs on morning shows. Airline industry analysts were invited on air to explain how rare and expensive was for an entire crew to be pulled from service mid-schedule. Some hinted that the airline's swift action was less about one passenger's meal and more about who that passenger was. When James finally addressed the matter, it was in the form of a short, written statement to a reputable business magazine. This was never about a meal. It was about professionalism, respect, and the commitment to delivering what has been promised. Whether a passenger is a CEO or a student on their first flight, the standards should be the same. Respect is not negotiable. The statement was shared widely, praised for its clarity and restraint. Many called it a masterclass in leadership communication, noting that James had managed to refocus the conversation from personal grievance to a broader issue of service standards. The airline, perhaps realizing the PR storm they were in, released their own statement a day later. They confirmed that the crew in question had been removed from active duty, pending the results of an internal review, and that immediate steps were being taken to reinforce customer service training. They stopped short of confirming any firings, but by then, the public had already decided the outcome. In the weeks that followed, the story remained a talking point. Business podcasts discussed it as an example of how reputation can hinge on small moments. Travel bloggers dissected it as a lesson in why customer service matters more than ever in the age of instant media. Some airlines quietly reviewed their own procedures for handling VIP passengers, though few admitted it outright. For James, life went on. He continued running his company, traveling for work, and speaking at events. Occasionally, someone would bring up that flight, usually with a grin as if they were in on some inside joke. James would respond the same way every time, a polite smile, a change of subject. But inside, he knew that day had made an impact far beyond one flight or one crew. It had reminded an entire industry of something they sometimes forgot in the rush, of schedules delays, and logistics that every interaction mattered. And that one passenger, on one day, could change everything. The flight had started as just another journey from New York to Los Angeles. It ended as a story told around dinner tables, boardrooms, and break rooms all over the country. And for the crew who had served in first class that day, it became the story that defined the rest of their careers, for better or for worse. James Carter had walked off that plane quietly, but the echo of his footsteps was still being felt, long after the aircraft itself had disappeared into the skies on its next journey.